Hello everyone, this is Dr. Jerome and welcome to our seminar in sociology class. For this seminar, we will be talking about critical discourse analysis or CDA. For this first video installment, we will be talking about critical discourse analysis and introduction. So for this particular installment, these are the topics that we will be talking about. We will be answering what is critical discourse analysis and how is it different or the same with critical discourse analysis or CDA. We will be also talking about briefly different concepts and principles of CDA. These are the concepts and principles that we will be talking in greater detail in future installments. And then I will give you an introduction to the CDA workflow and what are the critiques of CDA. So the sources for this particular topic outline are from the works of Paltridge in 2022 and then from two readings from Fairclough in 2010 and 2015. So before we go into a deep dive of what CDA is, let's talk about discourse analysis first. So discourse analysis is basically a study in qualitative research. It can be considered as a specific qualitative design, but in general, it is a transdisciplinary analytic configuration of how we study social reality by studying the patterns of language across text, looking at how society is described by the language that we used. Basically, for both discourse analysis and CDA, the argument is that language, the text, the different utterances that is written and also spoken, and even the paradigital affordances are influenced by and also generate certain situational contexts, like there are temporalities to it, meaning it is time sensitive, and also it reflects culture. And when we talk about culture, we talk about beliefs, norms, whether that's formal or informal norms. We talk about mores, right? We also talk about folkways, talk about beliefs and symbols. So basically the argument here is that language, the texts, the utterances, and the symbols across different modes, they are tied to contexts. And our goal as discourse analysts is to be able to see the different contexts that are tied into those texts. Next, discourse analysis also looks at how language is able to create meaning and how meaning can differ across texts or across genres of texts, across modes of texts, across modalities and transitivities of texts, right? And then also, language is able to create, reshape, reify, reproduce identity. And in sociological parlance, identity is basically an individual's organized set of personal traits, beliefs, social roles, and group affiliations that basically defines who they are, both to themselves and to others. So it's basically how individuals perceive themselves and are perceived by others within a particular social context. And the argument in discourse analysis is that language helps in shaping that, in reifying that, in reshaping that, right? And then also another thing that we believe as discourse analysts is that texts, utterances, whether that is from a conversation or a corpus or a newspaper or a text, it's actually reliant on or respondent to other texts. And we will be having a full discussion of what intertextuality means. But in this case, this conversation that I am having with you, this lecture that I am having with you, this is very much reliant on the work of Paltridge. And this is an example of intertextuality, right? I am producing new texts, but as I speak and do this lecture, but most of those texts are based on the work of Paltridge. And so my texts, as I speak, is based on Paltridge and Fairclough's texts. So that's an example of intertextuality, and the way different texts interact with each other is something that we're going to engage with in this particular course. So what is discourse, and why do we need to study about discourse? Now, Paltridge and Fairclough have, of course, definitions of what the discourse is. So when we say discurso or discourse, particularly the way we operationalize it in this class, what does that mean? So first, discourse is language in use. So from a linguistic standpoint, you can be studying about grammar, subject-verb agreement, subjects, predicates, etc. But when we do discourse analysis, the way it's different from other forms of linguistic analysis is that we are interrogating how language is being used, and again, how it's tied to context, how it's entangled to our identities, the meanings, and the relationships that we've had with people. No, as mentioned here, it's tied to social context, to situations. And then language, as any form of cultural artifact, is helping in organizing meaning, identity, and also forming, reforming, reifying, and reproducing the relationships within social groups, societies, and cultural groups. So that's Paltridge. That's kind of a very neutral way of talking about it. We just know that language is socially constructed, and at the same time, there is discourse also constructs society. But Fairclough adds the critical part wherein discourse is not only a social practice. It is not just tied to social context. It's not just a reification of social realities, but at the same time, it is connected to power. Meaning, language helps us in terms of coming into terms with how certain people are placed into hierarchies in our society, right? How certain genres of language, of ways of speaking and writing and consuming text tell us a particular class, a particular gender, and there are certain ways that language is able to organize that. And some, of course, are, in the side of being oppressed. And, of course, there are those who are trying to maintain power, and discourse is being used so that this seemingly taken for granted social organizations are reproduced and institutionalized in society. And, of course, ideology, whether that's heteronormativity, whether that's sexism or patriarchy, whether that's neoliberal classism, or whether that's globalization, whether that's fascism or techno-determinism, right? Language helps us in terms of creating and recreating them in society. And so, why do we want to study about discourse? So for Paltridge, it's important because we again know that language reflects culture, context, and identity, right? So we do understand that the texts that we engage with every day, they reflect our social realities, and it's important to know that so that we can better understand our society better. But for Fairclough, it also helps us in terms of trying to uncover or deconstruct those social inequalities with the hope of being able to challenge them, to expose them. Because most of the time, these social inequalities are so much entangled into the texts, and they are so much socialized into our lives, and they are so much embedded into the DNA of our culture that we no longer are able to see them unasked. So the goal here is for us to be able to wear this microscope of critical discourse analysis, see how language is able to recreate them. So even if it's very minute, even if it's very subtle, right? And sometimes those subtleties are the ones that are more dangerous in terms of verifying these inequalities and injustices, right? And how they are being sustained. And so the goal there is that, so if this is how language is sustaining these inequalities, how do we break away from that? How do we challenge that, right? And as we mentioned earlier, Paltridge argues that discourse is very much tied to our identity, and later on we will talk about what Paltridge calls a discourse community, wherein there's a group of people wherein certain language practices, social practices based on utterances and languages define them, right? So of course, this is so much different from an ethno-linguistic community. They're related, but like you can understand that a certain group of people are scientists by the way they write, right? And probably you know a Wattpad writer based on the way they write. And so our ability to be able to classify people in terms of their identity, whether that's a writer or a general person, is an example of how discourse is able to be performed through the language that we use, whether that's in conversation, in written text, and in paradigital affordances like liking certain things, no, putting emojis in certain things, right? And stuffs like that. And then the language choices that we use are the ways of showing who we are. And I think, when you talk about discourse communities, we see this, like the parlance of how generational differences, diversities in the way we communicate, right? How we are able to organize people based on age and generations because of the type of metaphors and memes that are communicated in a particular generation. And the way we say na, oh yeah, skibidi toilet is Gen Z, and jologs is a lower to middle class millennial Filipino, right? So those language choices and the way we construct language is an identifier of who we are in a particular social map, right? And so the type of greetings that we provide also tells us about the relationships that we have with a certain person. Like, of course, we would greet our friends differently as you would greet me, for example, a professor. Particularly if you've seen me for the first time, you'd be a little bit more respectful, a little bit more you'd feel that you need to have some form of ritual to kind of denote to me as someone with higher stature, until of course I engage in a conversation wherein, you don't have to call me this particular name and we can talk like we're equals, but unless I give that particular sort of quote unquote permission, you have sort of been socialized to use language to say na you're the student, I'm the teacher, right? Of course, the degree of politeness, you expect politeness in classroom, but sa isang inuman in a bar, you don't expect politeness, right? You sometimes the classier the words, the closer those friends are, right? And also service encounters, like the way there are certain scripts that nurses have when they care for patients. There are certain scripts that we have to take when we're call centers, but also there's scripts when you are trying to take care of a child and you're a mother or you're a father, right? And then also discourse is gendered, right? Bro, that's a masculine like interjection, right? And then of course we have sword speak, right? Or Bekinis ang tawag nga natin. No? Not very good at it though. And I think that's an identifier. Now you have the baklang canals and everything, no, and the way we are able to, have such layered Bekinis, no, as opposed to again, girls talking with each other, no, girl talk quote unquote, no, but of course there's more to it, no, than just that. Again, those are very obvious differences, but critical discourse analysis can help us sort of look at more subtle differences, like how word choices and organizations, no, are are more cisnormative, are heteronormative, are patriarchal, are misogynistic, right? And of course, we have different cultural styles of communication, and there are cultural categories about it. Like, For example, in the Philippines, we're more tacit and more non-confrontational in terms of our requests and our orders, as opposed to, let's say, a more Western individualized country. But also, Fairclough goes deeper into the critical space by saying that identity is also political. And so it recreates the unhealthy discourses of gender, of racism, of how AAVE, for example, or African American vernacular English is seen as a lesser form of English as opposed to, let's say, other forms of English within the larger United States, right? How neoliberalism, the way we certain texts say which people are to blame, who are the subjects, who are the agents in a particular sentence or in a particular speech, tells us how we are connected to a particular entity. And we'll be discussing that more in future discussions. So, again, discourses happen in context. And in Paltridge, we talk about context in terms of situation, like immediate settings, what is happening, what is the current space that we are doing this, what are the current goals in a particular situation. And of course, there is also the context of culture. But for Fairclough, we include, as I mentioned, power, ideology, and also how crisis is produced or challenged through the texts that we use. And also, we see that different discourses represent the world in different ways, right? So, let's say, for example, in a scientific academic parlance, right, we're looking at society, how it's organized, how the relationships of certain functions, right? But probably for common chismosa marites parlance, are the way we look at, we describe our community might be different, right? So, yeah, these different discourses represent the world in different ways. We're looking at the same social reality, but the interpretations would be different, across different discourse communities, right? Again, if you consider generations as different discourse communities, then they would have different way of using language to be able to describe and interpret the world around them, as opposed to older generations, right? Or younger generations, or for women, right? For working women, for women from indigenous groups. So intersectionality also happens here, as a part of identity and how discourse kind of solidifies your particular social position in the intersection of those access. And then Fairclough argues that discourses are never neutral. So in Paltridge, you're not necessarily going into the critical space. When you say critical, we view the world in a paradigm or in the reality is politically constructed, right? So there is conflict, there are opposing groups, right? And injustice is something that is created, recreated, reproduced, and the goal is to be able to challenge them, to expose them, right? So Paltridge doesn't necessarily require you to have that, but in Fairclough, which is CDA, not just discourse analysis, Fairclough argues that discourses are never neutral, right? There is no discourse that does not have any political agenda, right? So they legitimize or challenge power. So when we say fake news, while yes, there is truth that there is misinformation and disinformation out there, we always think deeper. Who is being favored by this fake news? Who benefits from this fake news? Who is the common target of the fake news, right? And that tells you about which particular agenda is being forwarded or mainstreamed in a particular society. And when we say free markets, like, is it really free? Right? So we always say free markets is okay because everybody has a chance of getting into a meritocracy. But, if you don't look at it critically, then you wouldn't know that not everybody is in the same ground, right? In the same starting point. And so the free quote-unquote market is not necessarily free as we think that they are. So as critical discourse analysts, our goal is to be able to look deeply into the texts that are seemingly non-harmful, seemingly neutral, and try to see whether there's something there that kind of disadvantage particular identities and groups, that tries to create fragmented relationships, right? To make certain people amass more capital, amass more privileges in life, and keep other people discriminated, marginalized, and minoritized. So that's our goal in CDA. Probably you've done this, in your life. Probably you've been looking at books and you see, what I'm reading is kind of problematic. Right? And that's okay, and that's sort of a start, But critical discourse analysis has a more systematic way of doing that. And again, we're going to be discussing that in class. Discourse is a part where domination works. Right? This is where domination, subjugation of people, and privileging of certain groups of people, of elites, happen. And in critical discourse analysis, we argue that this happens in the language that is being deployed in a day-to-day basis, right? And sometimes in the most subtlest of ways. And so what this separates discourse analysis from critical discourse analysis is obviously the qualifier critical, but it is not just an analysis, but it is also a critique of the underlying inequalities, injustices, domination, subjugation, minoritization, marginalization that is lurking within the text, utterances, and different affordances in language, and also trying to explain how they are currently producing injustices, or how they might potentially cause injustices, how they might potentially cause marginalization of certain groups, discrimination of certain groups, right? So, according to Fairclough, CDA believes that language has three, or discourse analysis has three general qualifiers or characteristics. One, it's relational. Two, it's dialectical. And three, it's transdisciplinary. So first, it is relational. It means that it studies relation between relations. What does that mean? So CDA examines how different social, political, and cultural relationships interact with and shape one another through discourse. So for example, let's talk about how media covers immigration. So the first relationship would be the relationship between media discourse and public opinion, of how media or news framing influences how we perceive immigrants. And then the second relationship would be the relations between the government policies and media narratives. It means that there are laws that shapes of what is reported and how reporting influences lawmaking. So when we have that relationship, so first is the relationship of media discourse and public opinion, and then media narratives with government policies. When we analyze them in CDA, we would study how media public opinion relations interact with media policy relations. For example, the way the media frames immigrants, which is the first relation, both depends on and reinforces or generates government's policies. Together, these relations construct broader social power dynamics around immigration. So, CDA kind of tells us, that we have to think not just a particular relationship language with a particular component of culture, but we look at multiple components, because we always remember, and our argument is that they're always entangled and that they reinforce each other. Now that brings us to the second characteristic of CDA, which is dialectical. So it studies about discourse and how it is dialectically related to power and how it's dialectically related to institutions. So it doesn't again study just single relations, but it is also dialectical. So it sees discourse and social structures as a two-way relationship. And what is that two-way relationship? One, discourse, the way we speak, the way we build our text, the way we read our texts, is shaped by power and institutions. And at the same time, discourse helps shape and hopefully challenges those power and institutional structures. Example, how does discourse reflect power? So, for example, political speeches framing immigrants as threats or assets influence how laws are made. So, if we see them as threats, then the laws that we make, would be more anti-immigration. And if you see them as assets, then we would be more welcoming of immigration, right? And so now, how does power dialectically relate to discourse? So existing migration laws and institutional practices like border controls, detention centers, I think in the States there's a lot of deportation. They shape also the kinds of narratives which is seen as legitimate in the media or political debates. And sometimes when it's spoken over and over again, it becomes reality. And probably you've heard Maria Ressa say something about 1,000 cuts, 1,000,000 lies told 1,000 times over becomes the truth, becomes a mainstream discourse, and that changes the way we look at things, and that kind of brings us to certain political relationships and tensions and polarizations that we're seeing today. And so when we say something is dialectical, it means that the discourse and power keep feeding into each other. Institutions constrains what can be said, but discourse can also change institutions. And so discourses like civil rights movements like hashtag babae ako, hashtag me too is an example of a discourse-oriented civil rights movements online, so that these things can be changed. Laws and policies are really basically texts that brings certain changes into power, right? That brings certain changes into reality, tries to influence behavior. And of course, you have the reinforcement, which is again a super different thing. It can be another conversation about it. But yeah, so that's what we mean by dialectical here. So discourse is shaped by power in institutions, and at the same time, discourse helps change or shape power in institutions or reify power in institutions. And then finally, critical discourse analysis is transdisciplinary, meaning it doesn't just look into linguistics, but it also looks into different disciplines such as sociology, politics, economics, communication studies, critical literature, right? Literary critique, development studies, gender studies, right? Critical family studies. So public health, so there are many ways that CDA can be used. So that is what separates another way that CDA is separated by just simple discourse analysis. Discourse analysis you can get away just by doing linguistics, right? But for critical discourse analysis, you have to have theoretical frameworks from sociology, and we'll discuss about different sociological frameworks that have been used for CDA and that can be deployed through CDA, etc. But many a time, we're using political sciences here, particularly if you're talking about neoliberalism, gender relations, masculine fascism, medical populism, etc. And so Fairclough argues that there are 3 stages of CDA. The first one is critique, wherein we try to find contradictions and expose power that are found in written verbal texts or utterances, right, across genres and modalities. And then after we're trying to expose what power lurks there, and again, going back at the relational part, we understand that institutions sort of are interwebbed in all of these relations. So it's not just one power structure. We see multiple institutions that try to legitimize a particular power, whether that power leads to injustice or marginalization, right? But the next is we have to explain. So how is discourse connected to the wider structures? How does it reify? In what points does it support that unequal power relations, right? And what is also very important is that we don't end there, but we propose action. So we understand that these types of language can help that is harmful. And so how do we now use our findings to change society? So now that we know that there are deleterious things that are happening because we use language in a certain way, or there is a particular technique that this particular powerful person who is making things difficult for a particular community is using this linguistic technique, this language to legitimize power. How do we now use language or other things to be able to dismantle that? So that's the third part. And that's, that is why it boils down into that critical paradigm. Critical paradigm is not just seeing that everything is political, everything is problematic, but at the same time, so now we see it's problematic. Now we see that there's inequality. Now that we see that there's injustice in society. So what do we do about it? How do we make it right? And so when we do critique of language using CDA, we must be able to do both normative and explanatory. Meaning, so if we find things are problematic in what standard? So we have to have some form of standard. So we say that there is gender inequality, right? So what is the problem and what is the standard? Why do we problematize misogyny? Why do we problematize heteronormativity? Why do we problematize patriarchy? Because we want gender equality. We want gender justice. So gender justice is the normative standard, right? It is what is right. No? So what is basically, what are the common normative normativities do we usually cling on when we do critical analysis? So usually we do rights, right? So and then we look at justice, social justice, as like a broad umbrella of what is norm. And then social justice has many forms across different intersectional identities. So you have disability justice, racial justice, gender justice. You have GSC related transformative justice, right? You have religious diversity and empowerment. You have indigenous people's rights. So these are climate justice. So this is what normative means. So usually we go towards the side of social justice. So, and this is where we evaluate the texts that we read. So why is this text problematic? Kasi it's not it's not fair, or it's false. It legitimizes falsity, and that falsity can be a deterrent to certain groups. It legitimizes certain people amassing so much capital and richness and privilege as opposed to other people, right? And at the same time, it's not just normative. We just say, mali yan. Bakit mali? How did we get to that point wherein this is now subtly put into the text? And our goal is to unpack that. So maybe you've heard of that in a Vox video. Let's unpack. So this is what we do. We unpack that. We look at the mechanisms of how that type of inequality or injustice is placed or seen or constructed into the texts that we see in a day-to-day basis. Right? And so the goal is that CDA must be able to do both. Hindi natin pwedeng sabihin na, that is misogynistic. Why is it misogynistic? What are the potential things that can happen if we let this particular pronouncement slide? right? What does it do? What can it potentially do? What is it currently doing? How is it currently doing that? So we both have to have that, no, so that it can be CDA, and it's not just a reach, no, it's not just a Twitter thread, right, of pointing things. So this is a little bit more scholarly. We're going to sort of look we do analysis of different texts so that we will be able to explain how a particular corpus or a particular set of text is able to deploy certain ideologies, hegemonies, power, etc. And as I mentioned, it's so put so subtly in the text that it feels common sense. And I think that as sociologists or as sociology majors, we do know that language can make inequality appear normal or natural, right? Let's say, for example, we say that the customer is always right, or we are all consumers. So when you say that everyone is a consumer, then you argue that the whole world is a market. So for example, in the discourse that they have in public value administration, wherein it looks at putting market parlance into public administration, we treat citizens as consumers. And when you treat citizens as consumers, then while of course you provide them their rights, but the citizenship part is kind of dismantled a bit. So when you say that we're stakeholders, everybody has a stake. So when you say stake, when somebody is a stakeholder, then you have a stake. You have both agency and constraints. No, you have interests. No, whether or not you will benefit from it, or you will be able to fully participate in it. But of course, stakeholder is also another. It's another problematic word lately, but we'll discuss that probably in a future discussion in class. But yeah, so it hides the structural differences. Like, yeah, we're all consumers, but not everyone has the same purchasing power, right? So when we say that, another would be, you can do it. For example, that. And so it gives you, yes, you can do it. It hides structure, right? You wear Nike, you can do it. But, it hides the structure that can constrain you from doing things, right? And then you see, so while this is empowering, there's also something shady about it, because it individualizes things most of the time, where in fact we should also be living in solidarity, and we also have to think about how the community and society and the government and the different institutions should be able to contribute to our agency, things like that. And so what we do is in CDA is that we again unmask these commonsensical things, these subtle things, these seemingly mundane things that is being said every day, right? Or that is being reported. The way we write news about certain things, right? And how that is able to create the identity and shape public perception. This is something that we have to interrogate in this class and in the things that we do for CDA. And so as I mentioned, CDA is in a qualitative parlance, is a design. And so it has to follow some form of systematic process. And so the systematic process, if CDA is done in the context of research, are as follows. Of course, we begin with a research problem. And the research problem should, of course, take into account that you have to be looking at texts. And that text can be as a post, a policy, an excerpt from a book, a novel. It can be a marketing collateral. Linguists and social linguists and sociologists have been looking at different types of texts because they can deploy, a lot of unequal power relationships, as we do. Now, we also collect texts, we can do multimodal, we can do multi-genre. We'll talk about the genre later, but that genre is basically a way of sort of arranging language so that it can represent a particular form of language, right? So for example, news is a genre, but within news there are subgenres. So there's a different way of you doing news. Let's say editorials have a different way. So it's sort of a structured way, but it's different from, let's say, an entertainment showbiz gossip news, as it would be different from a sports news, right? So, and probably would say, a Twitter post would be different from a Facebook post, from an Instagram comment, while they are within one ecosystem of discourse. They have different ways or structures of how they are done in practices. And when we say multimodal, it means that it can happen in different platforms or in different modes. Ayan, so na nakuha nyo na yung mga texts, you're now going to analyze those texts. No? It's either you look at the lexical choices, what are the implicit and explicit values or meanings that are being, of course, the explicit ones, no, that's a no-brainer. But of course, there are many things that are not being said in a particular texts that you also have to look at, no? And then those could be suggested by grammar, like for example, no, in my favorite example for this is when you use active or passive voice. So for example, when you say, the coffee beans in our shop are taken from the finest, let's say, coffee shrubs in Africa. And that particular sentence tells us that it's as if the coffee is made out of just the land. And in that narrative, the coffee farmers are taken out of the context, right? So what happens is that we highlight the product, right? And not the people who work for that particular product. No? And that's just one. There are many techniques that are being done, no, for us to be able to see whether certain grammatical choices or sentence construction choices or word choices sort of privilege certain people, invisibilize certain people, etc. No? And then, of course, choices of metaphors. And then how the arguments are built, whether there is some certainty, whether there is duty that is being suggested, what are the rhetorical devices that are being used. No? So those are the things that we will be investigating. And then, after looking at that particular text, then what do those mean? No? And then, of course, when you look at how they mean, you don't just look at it, within just the text or within just the grammar or the linguistics of it, but you have to anchor it with the theory, or you have to look at, the context. When I say members' resources, this is like the context of where they are. But it's more importantly, you're going to look at the theory. So whether or not that's symbolic violence by Bourdieu, for instance, or you're probably looking at governmentality by Foucault, or you look at gender performativity by Butler, or responsibilization, by the sociology of work and profession, or etc. And other things, or intersectionality, or decoloniality. So there are different theories and paradigms that you can use as lenses to be able to deconstruct or unpack these narratives. You can look at the lens of gender, lens of religious minoritization, etc. And then you now have to explain the links of that particular text to whatever power structure. Like for example, when you say power structure, then you is it related to patriarchy, heteronormativity? Is it related to ableism, ageism? Right? So those are the examples of power structure. Elitism, right? Colorism. Or is it related to institutions? Like is this violence springing from? Is this state-sponsored violence, right? Or is this violence against indigenous peoples, right? Or is this laws being used and reinterpreted so that the employers can get away with the discrimination and the exploitation that they do with their employees, no? And then of course we look at economy. Particularly, this is Fairclough's favorite. He likes to really talk about the ills of neoclassical capitalism, neoliberalism, no, and neoliberal globalization, right? So those are the things that we also have to look at how marketization, advertisation of society, no, is harmful, no? And then of course now we do the critique, right? And then this is what we explain. So now, what should be the right thing? What is just? What is true? What is fair? What is the right of the stakeholders involved in that particular text? And then we explain two mechanisms. One, how do these people in the oppressed side or in the marginalized sector in that particular discourse community, how are they being harmed potentially or actually in a particular text, no? Or what are the pathways wherein we can actually make a change or disrupt that particular narrative or discourse? And so that's number 7. We now propose an action. So now we see how the way we order text, we use words, we use grammar, argumentation, rhetorics to sort of center very harmful ideologies, hegemonies, and power structures into the text, and then normalize it and institutionalize and habitualize it in society. Now we know the mechanisms of how that is found in the text. How do we now produce a counter discourse against that? How do we now create movements so that we'll be able to resist that? Where are the points of agency and resilience for us to be able to have that? So that's for the praxis part. So that's basically the workflow that you will be expected to do for your final paper for this course. But yeah. So in conclusion, discourse analysis on its own basically interrogates how language works and how it works in a particular situation, in a context, how they shape and reshape and generate each other. But when you put the critical qualifier before the discourse analysis, you have to do critique. You have to identify what is normative and what are the explanatory mechanisms of why they can potentially harm or they are currently harming certain individuals or groups or society in general. And what action can we do to sort of correct it, to resist it, to foster resilience, to act against it. We also discussed about the different characteristic that makes Fairclough CDA unique and powerful, and it's because we talk about relations among relations of discourse and other forms of institutional powers in society, the tacit structures in society. We also understand that these relations are dialectical, meaning that they shape each other and they can constrain each other. And then that CDA is transdisciplinarity. This is not only within linguistics and language studies, but also it invokes theoretical frameworks in the social sciences, in particular like sociology, anthropology, political sciences, communication studies, etc. And so the goal is, in a nutshell, we want to be able to reveal hidden power that is entangled within those texts so subtly that it sounds like common sense, right? But using our sociological imagination and a very critical eye and examination of the text and the utterances and whatever linguistic affordances we have there, we are able to see how injustices are imprinted so subtly within texts, right? And our goal as CDA practitioners is to be able to deconstruct, unmask, unpack that, look at the mechanisms, how they're related and entangled with social institutions, etc. We have to expose the ideologies behind it, right? Why is a particular speech, which certainly sounds something that's empowering, that's very development oriented, but it's actually aggressive to certain groups, right? Why is it that when we talk about the resilience of the Filipino, why is it harmful even if it's very beneficial, it's very benevolent when you hear about, it's very celebratory, but there is some insidious meaning behind it, right? Why do we resist that discourse and narrative of resilience? What is not spoken there? What is not spoken in that in disaster resilience, particularly resilience that is individualized into communities, is the gaps in governance, in disaster governance, right? But we are expected to live with it because we are resilient, and that is something that we have habitualized. And now you're seeing resilience against that particular narrative because we see that those type of language, stories, discourses in the news, in the stories, on social media, it's already something that's normalized, and it's already taking the responsibility out of the hands of those who govern us. And so when we expose these ideologies that can be sometimes wrapped within benevolent messages, we're able to support social change. We're able to resist the inequalities, the injustices, the gaps in governance that are tied into those texts. And we can offer counter narratives. We can offer messages and initiatives for resistance to those things, right? But of course, there are also critiques against CDA. No, I wasn't able to put it here anymore, but certain critiques against CDA is that it's very highly interpretive, and it can be influenced by the positionality of the researcher who is looking at the data. Like, for example, for me, even if I'm not actively and intentionally doing CDA, on the texts that I read, my gender lens is always on. And this is because I have particular lived experiences as a queer individual, right? And as a person who has a mental health challenge, a diagnosed one, when I am able to become very sensitive against, right, against narratives that simplify or caricaturize mental health issues, right? And that's because when we analyze, we also are influenced a lot about our standpoints and our positionalities. And so it becomes very highly interpretive. And if you're coming from a very objective, positivist standpoint, like if you do a lot of statistics and if you believe in random, if you believe that reality is objective, then this is not something that we can be able to agree on, no, right? Because not only do we think that reality is subjective as CDA practitioners, but we also think that reality is politically constructed, and positivist researchers may not necessarily share that particular ideology with us, right? So that's one. And so it also means that you are limited by your own epistemic traditions. You are limited by your socializations, your own positionalities. Like, it's can be quite very it's going to be hard for me to look at violence against rurality, violence against those from the poorest of the poor, particularly because I don't have lived experience. So there is a danger for me to sort of caricaturize it, right? So it's really very important for me to sort of admit to it, study it, always take a step back when I do my CDA and say, how much of me is being bled into the analysis that I am doing. And that's super important, right? When we talk about CDA, and actually any type of qualitative research, and then of course it's also very much it's very linguistically oriented. It it has a tendency to say that everything is language, everything is text. Well, in fact, there are so many other artifacts, cultural artifacts that we can also look at, no, and maybe visual, let's say visual sociologists, no, or computational sociologists may also have a different sort of leaning, you know, in terms of how they describe reality. But in this case, we will be biased a bit about, text is a very rampant, dominant, mainstream cultural artifact that we want to look at to be able to sort of interrogate how society is organized in such a way that injustice, no, is being reproduced, reshaped, reinvented, innovated, no, reintroduced, no. And then of course, on the other side of the coin is, how do we resist it? What are the moments of resilience? What are the counter narratives and the counter discourses? How do we build discourse communities that are more inclusive, no, etc. So that is going to be the theme of our discussions for the next few weeks in this particular course. Now we're going to look at society, and we're going to come in from the context of social problems. Like we're going that our world needs retooling, our world needs transformation, because at the current rate, it's very unequal. There are a lot of injustices that exist. It's not a perfect society. We'll never be a perfect society, no. We're still far from utopia on the left and on the right, no. And so our goal is to be able to see how language stops us from being united, how language stops us from being a just society, and expose that, explain those mechanisms, and offer alternative discourses and narratives. So that's what we're going to be doing in this CDA class. So see you next week.